Alone. I like the hat.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you, David?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good. How's Phyllis doing?
Phyllis is doing very well, thank you. Making good progress.
Thank God. Good. That's awesome. All righty. Are we ready for Purim?
We are ready. So you made it through the storm last week with no problems?
Minor. The biggest issue I had is that I had outside a pipe had burst, and not only did the pipe burst, but the valve to shut it off froze.
Oh, goodness.
So I'm standing in freezing water above my ankles for 40 minutes trying to get it shut off. Finally did. After I watered the entire neighborhood, I got it shut off. And the lucky news is it's my sprinkler system, not the water to my house.
Good.
So on the other hand, getting it fixed, it's not exactly anybody's priority.
Yes, I understand that. We were fortunate. I'm in a high-rise condo, and we didn't lose power or water, so we were very fortunate.
Yeah, I spent one night at the synagogue in my office because we did lose water, and I've written a complaint that our floors are too hard.
Well, that should be the biggest of your problems.
Right, exactly.
So many of us are so fortunate. As bad as it was, and it was brutal, it wasn't what it could have been.
Yeah, you also realize as going through something like that was the world of the ancient world. They didn't have heat. They didn't have running water. What we take for granted is it's so wonderful.
Yeah,
Amen.
especially when
Amen.
in light of what we're going to study about today, not only did they not take their lives for granted, right?
Yeah.
Somebody was going to kill them if they walked outside, or
Yeah.
butcher them, or torture them, or Anyway, yeah. So we're very, very fortunate that.
I'm reading Michener's Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
And it's early times, and they would go whale hunting, and you were just expected to give up your life because in the process, because if you didn't get that whale, the whole community was going to die.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody
Well, even modern day, we have a friend up in Washington State that to support his family, he's a fishing guide usually, but to support his family, he does salmon fishing.
Mm-hmm.
And they lost 3 people, workers, who got in the process of catching salmon and on the boats, right? The commercial boats. Every year they lose 3 or 4 young men who go overboard, right? Doing that work. Ah. So yeah, still some dangerous occupations. Yeah,
Yes,
I'm wearing my Purim hat with all my Jewish feminist buttons on it for Vashti. Anyway.
For Vashti, okay.
Right.
It's an interesting book because you've got the issues of Vashti's suffering, but you also have the issues of Esther stepping up and really taking charge in a world in which it wasn't easy to do.
I heard an interesting rabbi commentary from Israel woman about the women of the Bible yesterday. It was great commentary. Anyway, so one my sister Judith, who's on the call, gave me. It says proud vocal Jewish woman.
There you go. All right, I've got 12:02. I'm going to wait one more minute and then we'll get started. Got a small group today, but that just means you have more opportunity to talk. Bring it. Welcome back. Thank you. All right, where we are is the 1880s. We lost Rosalind again. The 1880s to early 1900s. And today we're going to look at France and Russia in particular. Okay, so let's see. Make sure everybody gets in. There we go. Okay. There's a new burst of anti-Semitism that happens in the late 1800s that comes about at a time that the Industrial Revolution is changing life for everyone, everywhere. It's at this time you've got inexpensive machine-made products that can be found everywhere, as well as the fact that transportation is improving, and therefore the distribution of those products, those cheaper products, is also easier. And so what you have are new kinds of jobs and older jobs becoming obsolete. All right. And so it changes more than the way goods were made and distributed. It also changes the way in which societies are organized. Many of the people are leaving the countryside to find work in the factories that spring up in the larger cities. And you see governmental changes that happen as well. In a sense, this is almost the opposite of what we're seeing today with the ability to work remotely. I was just reading an article about people leaving Seattle and leaving the coast because they can work remotely, live at a much cheaper cost of living, et cetera. So people are moving out of cities today. With the Industrial Revolution, what you had was a whole shift into urban living. As with any major change, some people benefit as there are new job opportunities. Others lose everything. And those who suffer those losses become extremely angry and look for the proverbial scapegoat. I don't need to tell you who the lucky winners in that model are. All right. Every old stereotype about the Jews comes about: exploiters of the poor, usurers who get rich from the financial misfortunes of others. And this gets intertwined with the myth that exists that Jews are an evil race bent on world domination. And that combination turns out to be a disaster for Jews in autocracies like Russia, but also in democracies like France. So let's turn to France first. All right. Late 1800s, the Jews really constitute a small percentage of the people in France, 75,000 out of 39 million. You're talking less than 1/4%. Nonetheless, those 75,000 are relatively actively involved in the life of the nation. When Germany annexes Alsace and Lorraine in 1871, about a third of the Jews who lived in Alsace chose to relocate to the new French lands rather than remain in their homes and become German citizens. That tells you that life in France is still better than it was in the German occupied areas. But despite that, there are disquieting signs in the late 1800s that anti-Semitism is alive and well in France. 1886, a Frenchman by the name of Drumont writes a 2-volume collection of anti-Semitic rumors, myths, and insinuations in an attempt to prove that Jews are peculiar, and in his words, so very different from other human beings. In Drumont's view, Jewish peculiarity endangered life in France. He claimed that wherever Jews arose in power and wealth, the nation fell. While his book was not the first anti-Semitic book that is printed, it is the first book to become a bestseller. During its first year, over 100,000 copies are sold. It is reprinted over 200 times in the next 25 years. And Drumont insisted that he was not necessarily opposed to Judaism, but only to the to the Semitic race. So again, you've got the race issue playing out here. All right, David, you have my first square. David, do you have the text in front of you to read number 1?
Yes, I do.
Please.
Okay. What is the exact meaning of the frenzied campaign organized by world Jewry to panic France, dishonor the French army, and in so doing, put it in no condition to play a role in Europe? This campaign simply means that the totality of interests to which Jewry is composed has taken a position against France and finds it advantageous that France cease to be a great European power. It seems pointless to me in these articles, which are written from a philosophical and social point of view, to give myself over to puerile indignation and vain declamations on the subject. If the circumstances were such that I was invested with an authority that would permit me to save my country, I would turn the big Jews and their accomplices over to a court-martial that would have them executed. but in the theoretical and speculative domains, I find it quite natural and logical that the Jews do what they do. To think otherwise would mean falling into the mania common among Frenchmen who find themselves so lovable that they imagine that the whole world should love them. The Jews formerly had a nationality. They lost it because of their divisions and their absolute lack of any instinct of hierarchy and order. Thanks to their genius as conspirators and traffickers, they reconstituted a money power that is formidable, not only through the force that money itself possesses, but because the Jews have diminished or destroyed the other powers so that only theirs remain, because they have molded a society where money is the true master of all.
Okay, I'm not feeling no love. Yeah. All right, to reinforce his power, he also founds a newspaper which repeatedly claims that France was in the evil clutches of corrupt and unscrupulous Jews. In that newspaper, several of the articles were written by the Marquis de Morez, a wealthy anti-Semite who uses three basic foci to attack the Jews. One is that he claims they're Christ killers. Two, Jews run capitalism. And three, scientific racism, that Jews have negative characteristics innately. Initially, most of the Jews in France ignored these attacks, believing that it's just best to let these people talk. Don't worry about it. A captain in the French army by the name of Armand Mayer, one of the Jews that de Morez libels in the newspaper, is so outraged by the accusations that he challenges the Marquis to a duel. De Morez, a veteran of such duels, accepts the challenge and he kills Meyer, the Jew, in the confrontation. People throughout France are outraged and bombard the newspaper with complaints about the accusations and demand apologies for its libel of a respected army officer. Morez is charged with murder, but ultimately is acquitted. Nonetheless, they back down. Drummond and de Morez, they issue a statement expressing regret at the death of such an honorable man. Thousands attend Mayer's funeral. The rabbi who spoke at the service spoke of the army as a magnificent example of toleration. He sees the outpouring of sympathy for Mayer as an expression of, quote, the unifying force of French opinion in support of non-discrimination and decency. All right, so obviously it's not all bad. And yet 2 years later, 1894, a similar accusation would rock not only the French Jewish community, but the French army and the government, and public opinion was changing. I'm talking about the Dreyfus affair. All right, so we're going to get into that. 1894, in the German embassy in Paris, a French worker, a maid, discovers a document while cleaning the offices in the German embassy. She immediately turns it over to the French military intelligence officers. The document was a memo that listed French military secrets that the author was willing to sell to Germany. After reading through this document, it was concluded that the traitor had to be a member of the general staff of the army or to have access to the files and those of the Ministry of War. Through a process of elimination, they narrowed down their suspects to just a few officers. And ultimately, they reached a conclusion based on some handwriting that it was Captain Alfred Dreyfus, an officer in the general staff and the first Jew to hold such a position. Now, today, the evidence would seem flimsy for such a serious accusation, particularly against a man who has an excellent military record and no apparent motives. All right, let's talk a little bit about Dreyfus. As a child, he had dreamed of becoming an officer in the French army. He had worked his entire life to make that dream a reality. He wasn't particularly popular with his fellow officers, but he was getting regular promotions and the support of his immediate superiors. He was widely considered a man who played by the rules, not someone who took chances or cut corners. He also was very wealthy. So that he's not likely that he would have sold military secrets because he needed the money. Money wasn't an issue for him. Additionally, he was one of those people that had lived in Alsace who had made the conscious decision to move to France. This is a man for whom there's not a lot of motivation to do what he's being accused of. And the question becomes, why would he do so? November 1st of 1894, Drumont's newspaper becomes the first to publish the story denouncing Dreyfus as a Judas. The paper also falsely claimed that Dreyfus had confessed to the crime and that the army had absolute proof of his guilt. November of that year, most people in France, including most Jews, were initially convinced of Dreyfus's guilt. Yet by all accounts, the defense presented such a strong case at the trial that many began to think Dreyfus was going to be acquitted. And suddenly, two prominent men stepped forward with new dramatic evidence of Dreyfus's guilt. One is Hubert Henry. Hubert Humphrey was not there. Hubert Henry, the intelligence officer who headed the investigation. Towards the end of the trial, when the prosecution recalls Henry, he makes a startling statement. He has a highly reliable secret informant who has confirmed Dreyfus's guilt. Henry refuses to give the identity of the informant or provide any information about him, because he says to do so will endanger the informant and might lead to war with Germany. So I have proof. I can't tell you who it comes from. I can't tell you anything about him. I have proof. The last day of the trial, General Mercier offers new evidence. He sends the judges a sealed dossier that points to Dreyfus as the spy. The defense attorney, despite having the legal right to see the evidence, is not allowed to see it at all. The judges choose to ignore the law because the general tells them that if they reveal the contents of the file, it could endanger French intelligence officers. So now you have people are beginning to think he's going to be acquitted, and suddenly two different pieces of information show up that no one's allowed to see. After reading the files, the 7 judges unanimously find Dreyfus guilty of treason. He is sentenced to a ceremony of degradation and then deportation and imprisonment for life on Devil's Island, an island off the coast of South America, where over its years, 60,000 people were imprisoned and 2,000 survived. Okay? There was no escape because this is an island in which the currents are so strong, ships could barely get through, and it was also shark-infested waters. Now, throughout the trial, Dreyfus is not silent. He is shouting over and over at the degradation that he is innocent. A huge crowd had gathered for the ceremony, and when they heard Dreyfus's shouting, they responded by chanting, "Death to Dreyfus, death to the Jew." So clearly his race was considered by the population as well. All right. So does the press. One reporter wrote, "I need no one to tell me why Dreyfus committed treason. That Dreyfus was capable of treason, I conclude from his race." As soon as the trial ends, Dreyfus's family, particularly his brother Matthew, searched for evidence that would prove Alfred's innocence. But the brother is very reluctant to work publicly because he's afraid of stirring more anti-Semitic feelings. And he quickly learns that everything he and his family do is misinterpreted. When they try to meet with public officials, he's accused of bribery. When he looks for new evidence, he's accused of searching for a patsy, someone who could be blamed for Dreyfus's treason. Early in 1896, about a year and a half after the trial is over, Colonel Georges Picquart becomes head of the French military intelligence. He soon discovers that the Germans are still receiving military secrets from the French, even though the supposed traitor is thousands of miles away. The flow has not stopped. So Picquart begins to investigate, and his suspicions soon center on one man, somebody by the name of Walsin Esterhazy, a French officer known to be a gambler and a scam artist. And Picquart soon becomes convinced that Esterhazy is guilty. Matthew, Dreyfus's brother, sends Picquart a letter supporting those suspicions, and that's reading number 2. Bob, you've got the pleasure of reading number 2.
Okay. Monsieur Minister, the sole basis for the accusation leveled against my unfortunate brother in 1894 is a letter, unsigned, with no date, establishing that confidential military documents were delivered to an agent of a foreign power. I have the honor of informing you that the author of that piece is Monsieur Count Walsin Esterhazy, Commandant of the Infantry, placed on inactive service because of temporary infirmities last spring. The handwriting of Commandant Walsin Esterhazy is identical to that of the piece. It will be simple for you, Monsieur Minister, to obtain the handwriting of that officer. What is more, I am ready to show you where you can find letters from him of an incontestable authenticity and from a date prior to my brother's arrest. I cannot doubt, Monsieur Minister, that knowing the author of the treason for which my brother was condemned, that you will promptly do him justice. Please accept, Monsieur Minister, the homage of my profound respect, Matthew Dreyfus.
Picquart's superiors refuse to accept any of the evidence. They don't want to admit they might have made a mistake. One of them is said to have asked, "What does it matter to you if this Jew stays on Devil's Island?" Still others were claiming that even if Esterhazy is guilty, that doesn't mean Dreyfus was innocent. And what do to stop this process? They take Picquart and they send him to a post in North Africa. If you're going to make these accusations, you're gone. Before he leaves, however, he writes a letter that spells out his reasons for believing that Esterhazy was guilty. And many think that his lawyer leaks this information to a member of the parliament. And so there are rumors. Rumors begin to, with those rumors come about that Esterhazy, that the Jews had found their patsy in Esterhazy. They also whispered that Jews had paid Picquart to say Dreyfus was innocent. In the end, these rumors are powerful enough that Picquart's superiors decide to stop the rumors by putting Esterhazy on trial, believing that the information about him, the case against him, is so weak, they were at no risk. And it turns out they were right. His court-martial ended with a verdict of not guilty. And when he leaves the courtroom, the crowd outside greets him with cheers. January 13th, 1898, 3 days after the trial ends, France's most famous novelist, Émile Zola, writes a letter to the president of France. It was published in a newspaper under a huge headline, "I accuse." Zola accused the government and the army of conspiring to convict Dreyfus. He makes the claim that at the trial, powerful officials had covered up the truth. And he says that, and when he put this, his writings, he gave it to the newspaper, 2 100,000 copies of the newspaper that day sold in Paris alone. The government turns around and they charge Zola with libel. He had insufficient proof, and the result is he's found guilty, and rather than go to jail, Zola flees to England. But his accusations and the government's response pull thousands of people into the controversy. Everyone's talking about it. Those who disagreed with Zola, who felt that he was guilty, took to the streets and they attacked Jewish businesses. They attacked synagogues and homes, including Dreyfus's residence. There were anti-Jewish riots in over 70 cities in France. The violence in the streets troubled so many people on both sides of the issue that many decided it was time to take a stand. There was a call for a new Dreyfus trial in the hope that this would settle the matter once and for all. The new chief investigator, by the name of Louis Signet, it's spelled C-U-I-G-N-E-T, Signet, quickly discovered that Hubert Henry, remember this is one of the officers that came forward with the last minute testimony at the first trial, he had forged evidence and lied to the court. Signet's finding became public and Henry is arrested. But before he could be questioned, he commits suicide and promptly becomes a folk hero. Thousands were convinced that the Jewish syndicate had murdered him. Realizing he was in trouble, Esterhazy flees to England, and there he confesses that he was the guilty party with the first memo that Dreyfus had been accused of. Once again, however, many people insisted that the Jews had paid Esterhazy to say that. August of 1899, 5 years after the conviction, Dreyfus is retried, and despite everything, he is re-convicted. Strangely, the next day, however, he gets pardoned. The court did not declare Dreyfus innocent until 1906, 12 years after his conviction. Only then is he reinstated as a captain in the army. Now, I want to recommend a book. I'll hold it up. Its title is just Dreyfus, and the author is Ruth Harris. I'm going to tell you that this is about one of the most densely written books I've ever read. And I don't normally skim. I did skim, but even in the skimming, there's lots of valuable information here. All right, it's just incredibly dense. There are details of that I don't know why anybody would want to know, but the bigger picture stuff is great. Judith, do you have a question? Yeah.
It's not so much a question as just a comment. I am a lover of Impressionist art.
Okay.
And at this time, the artists were divided. Pissarro, being Jewish, sided with Dreyfus, and so did Monet. Degas was a big anti-Semite, and he publicly declared his anti-Semitism, and it just got worse over the years. Renoir, my favorite, didn't publicly say anything. He tried to be neutral, but in private, he was known to make anti-Semitic remarks. It divided people like that all over France in the pro-Dreyfus, anti-Dreyfus, whatever you want to call it, situation.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate that. I've made a note about Degas in my head. Thank you. All right. 1894, Theodor Herzl, you've probably heard of Herzl, then a reporter for the Austrian newspaper, is covering the ceremony in which Dreyfus is degraded. Although Herzl had recognized the power of anti-Semitism long before the Dreyfus Affair, this event strengthens his views. And in 1896, he writes, reading number 3, and Judith, you're back on if you have the text.
The Jewish question still exists. It would be foolish to deny it. It exists wherever Jews live in perceptible numbers. Where it does not yet exist, it will be brought by Jews in the course of their migrations. We naturally move to those places where we are not persecuted, and there our presence soon produces persecution. This is true in every country and will remain true even in those most highly civilized. France itself is no exception, till the Jewish question finds a solution on a political basis.
All right. So he proposes the solution. We need our own country. We need a Jewish state. That's another course, but it is an outcome of the Dreyfus Affair. And I just wanted to make that point. Okay, that's another course unto itself. All right, let's go. Everybody get on your traveling shoes. We're heading over to Russia and Eastern Europe. 1772. Russia, together with Austria and Prussia, have a takeover of Poland and the first division of its land and its people. There's 2 more partitions that follow. By a curious turn of destiny, Russia, in this takeover of lands, gains nearly 1 million Jewish subjects, and in so doing becomes a governor of the largest body of Jews in the world at the time. The Eastern Orthodox or Byzantine Church was Russia's official church, and as defenders of their faith, the czars of Russia do not want to open their country to Jews. In the end, however, the czar decides that the Jews could remain in the formerly Polish parts of the country, but they couldn't settle anywhere in the heart of Russia. The area to which they're confined was known as the Pale of Settlement, an area which was made up of 9% of Jews. And I think I gave you a map in the handouts. You have a sense of the Pale of Settlement as well. About 9% Jewish there. Historically, let's go 1801 to 1825, the liberal-minded Alexander I. And everything here, when I say liberal-minded, it's all relative. Please understand. The liberally minded Alexander I witnesses relatively benign efforts to wean Jews from occupations as middlemen to agriculture and handicrafts. And he's doing this as a way of breaking the hold of the rabbinate. Remember, we've got the rabbinic control over these lands during the time. After Napoleon's defeat, however, Alexander changes and he drives the Jews further into the Pale. He is succeeded by Nicholas I, who has a 30-year reign, and under his rule, Jewish history reaches its nadir. Things are bad. He is a typical xenophobe. He introduces hundreds of disabling laws to curb Jewish activities. And in 1827, he establishes the infamous military conscription of Jewish youths at the age of 12, extending their service as long as 25 years. All right.
What year was that? 1825, you said?
He comes into power in 1825, and the conscription is 1827 begins.
Mm-hmm.
All right, yeah, I knew I'd skip the page here. According to a memo that the Tsar sent to his generals, he says the chief benefit to be derived from the drafting of the Jews is the certainty that it will move them most effectively to change their religion. These youngsters are transported to the farthest outposts of the empire, and they are tortured in an attempt to get them to abandon their Jewish living. Many did convert, and many held out. Jewish parents, knowing this is going on, try desperately to keep their sons out of the army. And you begin to see internal Jewish politics as a result. Wealthy Jews are being allowed to purchase substitute Jews to serve in their sons' places. And where do those come from? The poor families. Each Jewish community had to provide a certain number of 12-year-old recruits. If the community could not provide that and meet that quota, boys as young as 8 or 10 were forced into the army to make up the necessary requirement. Jewish catchers, Jews, went about abducting any Jew on the street, young Jew on the street who happened to be, who wasn't connected to somebody without passports in order to fulfill the quota. You see a disintegrating Jewish community happening as a result. 1855, Nicholas dies. Many Russians at this point are calling for economic and political reform. Alexander II, the new czar, announces plans. He is going to modernize Russia and provide education, equal justice, tolerance, and humaneness for every citizen. Almost immediately, he relaxes censorship laws and he eases restrictions on foreign travel. Universities are now open to students from all parts of Russian society, the poor as well as the rich. He reduces military service from 25 to 6 years, even less if you were going to high school or college. He abolishes a military preparation program for young Jewish boys as well. This time definitely marks a step forward, but it is less so for Jews than it is for the larger population. Even though many Jews hoped that he would eventually expand their rights, Alexander privately told officials that he expected the Jews to earn their civil rights through moral improvement, which is code words for conversion. To his surprise, not all the Russian population was in agreement. There was an editorial in a newspaper published by the Ministry of War, which declared, I don't think this is in your notes. All right, I'll read it. Let us be worthy of our age. Let us abandon the childish habit of presenting the Jews in our literary works as ridiculous and disreputable creatures. On the contrary, let's remember the causes that brought them to such a state. Let us offer them a place among us. Let us use their energies. Let's use their readiness of wit and their skills as a means for satisfying the growing needs of our people. Those kinds of statements reflected a belief that the Jews could actually make a positive contribution to the Russian society if they had more freedom. And in the 1860s, a new law opened the Russian state, the school system run by the state, to Jewish students. And the government-run schools specifically for Jews gradually disappear. Young Jews are thrilled because by getting into these state schools where everybody else is going and becoming graduates, they would then become eligible for government employment as well as commercial and professional careers in the heart of Russia. This is a major statement. Over time, however, Alexander becomes disillusioned with the progress of the Jewish policies and resentful of the fact that the Jews are engaged in the liberal movements, which he is fearing. Investigations begin anew. The Jewish schools are closed and restrictions are reinvoked, including a ban on Jewish advancement in the military and in the local government. Anti-Semitism intensifies throughout the 1870s. Many Russians believed that Jews were becoming too powerful and had too many privileges. There's articles in the Russian newspapers reinforcing the warning of the dangers Jews pose to Russia. They claim that the presence of Jewish students in state schools will lead to Jewish domination of professions such as law, engineering, medicine, architecture, fields and careers that had been dominated previously and opened previously only to Russians. other publications hold Jews responsible for the revolutionary movement that's arising in Russia, as well as all the evils associated with both socialism and capitalism. Anybody who has facts and logic to counter these arguments is ignored. One writer provided statistics to show that non-Jews who lived in the Pale of Settlement alongside all of the Jews were better off economically than non-Jews who lived outside the Pale of Settlement. All right. And this study is confirmed by the government. All right. No one disputed the facts, but don't let facts get in the way. It doesn't change the widespread belief that Jews were, a mass of usurers and hucksters of dubious honesty who will enrich themselves by exploiting gullible Russians. So don't confuse me with facts. This anti-Semitism wasn't, as well as we've seen, was not unusual, and it might have blown over, except for an unexpected event on March 1st of 1881 that changed everything. Alexander II is shot to death in St. Petersburg. Some Jews compare the days following his assassination to living on top of a volcano. Rumors that were out that Alexander III, the son, had ordered the Russians to attack the Jews, and that anyone who failed to attack Jews would be punished severely. In a public way, he denies the rumor, but behind the scenes, people insisted that he really did want everybody to be beating up on the Jews. They were convinced that he issued the denial to quiet the foreign policies. The violence begins on April 15th in Elizabethgrad, and the rioting quickly spreads to other parts of the Ukraine and much of southern Russia. On April 26th of 1881, it reaches Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, and a witness to that reports the first day of rioting. Sandra, if you have reading number 4, that's yours.
Yeah. Okay. Witness of Kiev rioting 1881. At 12 o'clock noon, the air echoed with wild shouts, whistling, jeering, hooting, and laughing. An enormous crowd of young boys, artisans, and laborers was marching. The entire street was jammed with the Barefoot Brigade. The destruction of Jewish homes began. Window panes and doors began to fly about. Shortly thereafter, the mob, having gained access to the houses and stores, began to throw upon the streets absolutely everything that fell into their hands. Clouds of feathers began to whirl in the air. The sound of broken window panes and frames, the crying, shouting, and despair on one hand, and the terrible yelling and jeering on the other, completed the picture. Shortly afterwards, the mob threw itself upon the Jewish synagogue, which, despite its strong bars, locks, and shutters, was wrecked in a moment. One should have seen the fury with which the riffraff fell upon the Torah scrolls, of which there were many in the synagogue. The scrolls were torn to shreds, trampled in the dirt, and destroyed with incredible passion.
This is the beginning of the riots in Kiev. A new word is accompanying all this. The word is the pogrom. The term pogrom comes from the Russian word for thunder, the sound that you hear just after lightning strikes, signaling a storm to come. And now the word comes to be referred to an organized and sometimes officially encouraged massacre. In the years immediately after these pogroms that happened, about 35,000 Jews leave Russia for Palestine. But many, many more emigrate to North America and Western Europe. Between 1880 and 1914, more than 2 million Russian Jews resettle in the United States. In the 1880s, the Jews had no way really to resist. Poorly armed civilians were no match for mobs supported by police battalions and an army. and a few Jews decided that their best hope was to let the world know what was happening. A small group of Orthodox Jews in Russian Lithuania form a secret society to do just that. And a letter describing their experiences was sent to prominent Jews in other countries, trying to get the events to be well known. The letter addressed to England was sent to Baron Nathaniel Rothschild. So once again, you hear the Rothschild name. He immediately turns that letter over to the Times of London, and a reporter uses the information to write two articles which appear on January 11th and January 13th of 1882. The beginning of the first article suggests the power of the story they wanted told. That's reading number 5. Rosalind, do you have the text? Would you give us number 5?
Men ruthlessly murdered, tender married women, the prey of brutal lust that has also caused their death, and young girls violated in the sight of their relatives by soldiers who should have been the guardians of their honor. These have been the deeds with which the population of southern Russia has been stained since last April. The article ended with a call to action by the editor of the Times. It is the lesson taught by all experience that the only solution of the Jewish question is the granting of full equality. The Russian Jewish question may be summed up in the words, are 3.5 million of human beings to perish because they are Jews?
So these articles, this article and the one that follows in the Times, they prompt demonstrations in support of Russian Jews. The leader of the Catholic Church in England condemns not only the violence that is happening, but the degrading laws that had harassed Jews throughout Europe for the centuries. Prime Minister of England also acknowledges the horror of the pogroms, but he refuses nonetheless to send popular resolutions or even petitions signed by British Jews to the Russian government. He refuses to respond to the United States' request that American and British governments jointly approach the Russians. Now, many believe that his reasons for refusing to do so and to have a public discussion was because he was convinced it was more likely to be harmful to the Jewish population of Russia. He told them that he would prefer to rely on private official contacts, and it suggests that the Russian government had been threatening to further harm the Jews if other countries got involved. Despite that, many of the nations did get involved, and they did send messages and petitions to Russia. Demonstrations took place in many countries, including the United States, France, Spain, Italy. The Tsar ignored it all. Now, the foreigners were not the only ones who were not happy with the pogroms. Some of the internal non-Jews in Russia also were disturbed. You hear the word economics. Let me emphasize the word economics. They believed that the government's policies were hurting the Russian economy. On March 30th of 1881, not long after the pogroms begin, one of these Russians, an important textile manufacturer in Moscow, sends a letter to the Minister of the Interior outlining some of the economic problems he was having as a result of the pogroms. He usually sold his cloth to Jewish merchants in the Ukraine, but now they're unable to work, and so they can't pay their bills. And if this continues to happen, he says, he will be forced to make less cloth and to lay off Russian workers. He urged the government to stop the military actions against the Jews. Economics, 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 economics. Independent observers, diplomats from Austria and Hungary, confirmed the manufacturers' fears. They reported that in the areas where the pogroms were happening, it was almost impossible for peasants or ordinary workers to borrow money. Jewish lenders were not going to lend money to people if they didn't feel it was going to be repaid. And as a result, train stations in central Russia were jammed with peasants looking for work. over the next decade, more and more Russians give up any hope of true reform. And so you start to see the revolutionary groups arising. These groups have little in common with one another other than opposition to Tsarist rule. To try and turn attention away from himself, the Tsar therefore decides to try and unite the Russian people against a common enemy. All right, so let's make it worse for the Jews. In 1903, his agents begin to organize pogroms and to revive the old blood libels. In May of that year, a government-supported newspaper charged that the Jews had killed a Christian child so that they could use his blood in the making of matzah. A government-backed patriotic society known as the Black Hundreds, having read that charge, take to the streets to demand justice, and within hours, a pogrom is underway. However, these revolutionary groups in Russia were quick to point out that this pogrom had been planned by the government from start to finish. And the New York Times confirms those claims. And Karen, I think you've got reading number 6.
This is good because my paternal grandfather came from Kishinev.
Really?
Yeah. And I was just trying to look it up while you were talking, but there was some family talk about a cousin of his being involved in an assassination attempt against the Tsar around 1903. That's not why my grandfather came in 1920, but
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, the anti-Jewish riots in Kishinev are worse than the censor will permit to publish. There is a well laid out plan for the general massacre of Jews on the day following the Russian Easter. The mob was led by priests, and the general cry, "Kill the Jews," was taken up all over the city. The dead number 120, and the injured about 500. Babes were literally torn to pieces by the frenzied and bloodthirsty mob. The local police made no attempt to halt the reign of terror. At sunset, the streets were piled with corpses and wounded. Those who could make their escape fled in terror, and the city is now practically deserted of Jews.
In the end, even the pogroms could not stop change from reaching Russia. The revolution was going to happen. In 1905, after a disastrous defeat in a war with Japan, the Tsar was forced to make changes that reduced his powers. In February, he organized an advisory council, or known as a Duma. I don't know if my accents are right. I went right to the Hebrew accent. All right, I don't know if it's a Duma or a Duma, but I'll go with the Hebrew.
It's probably Duma.
Duma? Okay. He and his followers tried unsuccessfully to deprive Jews of the right to vote on the grounds that they weren't full citizens. October 17th, the Tsar is forced to issue a manifesto guaranteeing basic freedoms of all Russian citizens, including the Jews. And so once again, the government, in response to that, organizes massive demonstrations to protest these changes. And it leads to riots directed against the Jews. An investigation by the Duma later revealed that leaflets urging violence were printed not privately, but at police headquarters and financed by the Tsar himself. This uprising ends in 1907, and the Tsar is still in control. So what does he do? He mounts a new campaign against the Jews, and as part of that campaign, the Russian secret police produce a forgery known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And we'll deal a little bit with that next week. It was said to be proof that the Jews were plotting world takeover. Like other myths, it would spread quickly to countries around the world in the early 1900s. Now, I want to go to one other event that was happening in the 1800s. Again, you need your walking shoes. Back to Grant, Ulysses S. Grant. Well, we'll read what he wrote, and then I'll give you some context on it afterwards. During the Civil War, November 9, 1862, the following order was issued by Ulysses S. Grant, Command Headquarters. Reading number 7. Who hasn't read yet? Would you do the honors? We can't hear you, though.
All right, let's try it again. The Jews, as a class violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the department within 24 hours from the receipt of this order. Post commanders will see that all of this class of people be furnished passes and required to leave, and anyone returning after such notification will be arrested and held in confinement until an opportunity occurs of sending them out as prisoners, unless furnished with permits from headquarters. No passes will be given these people to visit headquarters for the purpose of making personal applications for trade permits.
Okay. The following day, Grant instructs General Webster, he says to him, give orders to all the conductors on the railroad that no Jews are to be permitted to travel on the railroad southward from any point. They may go north and be encouraged in it, but they are such an intolerable nuisance that the department must be purged of them. This order goes into effect immediately. Army officers order all Jewish traders and their families in all the border towns to leave the territory. Now, Grant may not have intended these results. His headquarters expressed no objection to continued presence of Jewish settlers, only to cotton traders. But the wording of the order addressed all Jews, regardless of occupation, and that's how it was implemented. A group of Jewish merchants from Paducah, Kentucky, led by a gentleman by the name of Haskell, sent a telegram to President Lincoln in which they condemned the order as the grossest violation of the Constitution and our rights as good citizens within it. The telegram noted that it would place us as outlaws before the world. We respectfully ask your immediate attention to this enormous outrage on all law and humanity. Throughout the Union, Jewish groups protest and sent telegrams to Washington, and it attracts significant attention in Congress and from the press. The Democrats condemn the order as part of what they see as the U.S. government's systematic violation of civil liberties, and they introduce a motion of censure against Grant in the Senate, one that passes 31-7. Some newspapers supported Grant's actions. The Washington Chronicle criticized Jews as scavengers of commerce. Most newspapers, however, were strongly opposed, with the New York Times denouncing the order as humiliating and the revival of the spirit of the medieval ages. Haskell leads a delegation of Jews to Washington, D.C., and on January 3rd of 1863, after meeting with congressmen, they go to the White House. Lincoln receives the delegation. He studies the copies of Order Number 11, and he tells his General-in-Chief, Halleck, to have Grant revoke General Order Number 11, which Halleck does in the following message. He says, a paper purporting to be General Orders Number 11, issued by you December 17th, has been presented here. By its terms, it expels all Jews from your department. If such an order has been issued, it will be revoked immediately. One of Halleck's staff officers privately explained to Grant that the problem lied in the excessive scope of the order. Had the word peddler been inserted after Jew, he says, I do not suppose any exception would have been taken into the order. It was aimed at a particular profession. Grant formally revokes the order on a few days later in 1863. All right, I'm going to stop there. There's several wonderful books on this, and one I can't find. There's one literally called Order Number 11, and I can't find it. But there's another one that I read that said when Grant expelled the Jews by Sarna. Anything by Jonathan Sarna is going to be a good read. All right, Judith.
Two things real quickly. Yes, there was an article just a couple of weeks ago that was reprinted from 2015 in the foreword that talks about a book called Lincoln and the Jews, A History, that was co-written by Sarna and Chappelle, Benjamin Chappelle. And the article, just a little bit about it, talks about General Orders number 11. And, it says that Lincoln didn't want to make his best general unhappy. So he gave the order to someone else to give to Grant.
Yeah.
One more comment that it came to mind when I was reading, all of this was about the Pale of Settlement. And I don't know if anyone else saw that when Merrick Garland testified at his hearing a few days ago,
Yeah.
he got emotional and he talked about how his maternal grandparents came to the U.S. in the early 1900s from the Pale of Settlement.
A large majority of us, that's where our families are from.
Yeah.
We have stories we could probably tell for hours and hours. I need to finish, and I need to share one last perspective before I do. I apologize, Bob. I don't want to leave Grant where we just left him, because Grant's legacy is not as clear-cut as I just presented. He really denied the anti-Semitic accusations. And as he became his run for president really was loaded because of this order. But in his term as president, he appointed more Jews to the cabinets and to government leadership than any president before him. And he went out of his way to try and convey a message that contradicted the General Orders number 11. All right. We don't count. You're right. We're not sure why. And his legacy, therefore, is a bit confusing. I've heard several lectures on this topic in recent months. There were a couple of good lectures given at Hadar as well. So I didn't want to leave it with Grant as the great anti-Semite. All right. I want to make it clear there's clearly ambiguity here. This order was a bad thing. There's no question about it. But whether it reflected his true opinions based on his later actions is unclear. Bob, you had your hand up, and then David. Yeah.
Yes, I was going to mention the same thing you did. Jonathan Sonner gave a lecture at one of the synagogues that I attended, where he was talking about the mixed situation with Grant at the very beginning with Order number 11, and towards the end of the Civil War, later on when he was running for president, right, that it was a mixed bag, and that he, in the end, he didn't really consider him an anti-Semite. The second thing I wanted to say was the marked difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe in terms of the physical violence that occurred against Jews, which really accounts for the disproportional exodus of Jews from Eastern Europe and Russia as a result of the pogroms. Right. And not to leave the subject, but without mentioning Bialik, who wrote a beautiful poem, it was kind of gruesome, of the Kishinev pogrom, in which he describes, and it not only describes the gruesomeness of the pogrom, which is described here somewhat, but it was a call to Jewish men to do more to defend their families.
Thank you. I've got to get a hold of that. Good. David?
On the front page on the outline, you also mention in number 4, Romania. I know we're at the end of the hour. We haven't had a chance to talk about it. I'm particularly interested since my maternal grandparents came from Romania. So if you don't get to it today, then certainly the next time I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
I will try. There's not a lot. I don't have a lot. It was in passing, but I had to make some choices in how I did this. And so I apologize. Look, the reality of it is we're talking about hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years and hundreds of events. And along the way, whatever I do, I'm leaving things out.
Understood.
How do you spell Sarno's last name? Jonathan?
S-A-R-N-A.
I'm sorry.
S-A-R-N-A.
Yeah, he
Thank
heads the American Jewish Archives at Brandeis University too. He was one of my classmates, and his father, Nachum Sarna, is a great biblical scholar. He taught for many years. Yeah, so he's an expert on American Judaism, and certainly his book on Lincoln is incredible research. Yeah.
So this is another of his works that a fascinating read, American Judaism.
Mhm.
By the way, I think next year what I'm going to teach is American Jewish history. I think that's the course I'm going to teach next year.
That's great. He's a great resource.
Yeah. All right, my friends. Thank you. We'll continue on next week. Oh, by the way, we're going to have class the next 2 weeks. It wasn't on the original schedule. I'm finishing a week early. I'm having class next week and the week after. So 2 more weeks of this class. All right.
Good.
Thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure. I appreciate the wisdom that comes back. It's wonderful.
Purim Sameach.
Purim
Thank
Sameach.
you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Enjoy your Hamantashen.
Thank you.
So, man.
Meet him.